Welcome back to another episode of the Sky Society podcast. Today, I am super excited to be chatting with Emily Blumhardt. She is the Senior Manager of Global Brand Integrated Communications at Shiseido. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Emily has had quite the zigzag career journey. So we have a lot to talk about. But before we jump into all of that, can you tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So like you said, currently I'm on the communications team at Shiseido. The brand that I'm supporting is Tory Burch Beauty, which has been such a great experience. Prior to that, I was a producer in the advertising industry. Really had a career pivot there through getting my MBA, but I've been in New York for about 6 years now, originally from Montana, which is just also such a transition. But yeah, I've been here and I've just been loving the city and I've really loved finally diving into the beauty industry.
Yeah, your career journey is really interesting, and I'm especially excited to talk about the master's piece because I know a lot of people consider getting an MBA or go back and forth on that decision. And your journey too, you went from Montana to undergrad in Southern California at Chapman University, then over to New York. So I can see you had a hunger to move over to some big cities. So before we move into this master's piece, I want to go and start back at Chapman. Can you tell me a little bit about your decision to go there? And you studied PR and advertising, and a little bit about your experience there.
So I always knew I wanted to move to New York ever since I was like 12 years old. I'm a big
Really?
thinker. So I always knew I was going to move here. I didn't necessarily know what I was going to do. I just knew I was going to end up here. So for college, I did look at NYU or Columbia, but I was like, I'm going to end up there eventually. So I want to try something new. And what's not to love about Southern California. So just through that decision making, I ended up at Chapman, which for anyone that doesn't know, it's a smaller school. It's right near Newport Beach in Orange County. Great place to go to college.
Yeah.
And when I came into Chapman, it's a dual major, advertising and public relations. And I kind of knew I wanted to go that route post grad, but then randomly my freshman year, I decided I also had affinity for political science. So I ended up double majoring in political science as well. And it was really interesting. I didn't really know necessarily what I wanted to do in my undergrad for a hot minute. I wanted to be Olivia Pope 2.0. I wanted to move. I was thinking now I'm going to move to DC and support politics and do that. Then I wanted to do corporate crisis communication. Then I wanted to do fashion PR. Then, I was all over the place, being so close to LA too. I thought I wanted to go into entertainment PR. So I really had a bunch of interesting experiences throughout my college career, just kind of working to figure out where I wanted to go. And through all of that, I ended up kind of finding my place within advertising. And I was really interested in the agency side of things, being able to work with a bunch of different clients. So through just different internships, I ended up getting placed in one of them on the production team. And I also incredibly loved that experience. So really just by happenstance and by some agency deciding with my track record, that'd be a good place for me, I kind of found an affinity for that as well, which has ended up post grad where I started my career. So
I think that's a very good example of it's okay if you don't have everything figured out and when you are in school and you're in college, like how you said, there was like a dozen things that you thought that you maybe could do. And it's interesting because I feel like a theme sometimes when I interview guests is like a lot of it is just kind of not by accident, but it's just like you had an internship, they were like, you'd be good here, and then you did it, and then you loved it. And I feel like a lot of people start their career that way, where it's maybe not the specific thing that you specifically thought that you were going to be great at, but that you kind of fall into and really, maybe find a passion or really enjoy.
yeah, I think especially I would kind of consider myself a type A personality. And I always was someone that envisioned, before I got to college, I was gonna have this very linear path of where I wanted to get to go, like end up being. And I was gonna follow this specific stepping stone career path to get there. And even to where I am today, farther into my career, that's honestly just not what happened. Whether it's honestly your personal life or your professional life, things don't necessarily go the way that you want them to, or you envision them doing it. Because to your point, I started doing something that I was interested in, didn't actually love it as I thought as much as I was going to when I started getting that real world experience. And when you have this plan, having a comfortability and knowing you can pivot. I think there's also a lot of fear that you can't pivot, especially, it applies to even when you're later in your career. People are terrified to do the pivoting if they end up wanting to do something else. So I kind of learned early on to embrace that and feeling okay trying different things, because eventually you're going to find something that you really, really are in love with. And also on top of that, it's okay for that to change as you grow and develop different skill sets.
Yes. And we're going to get into all the different times that you've changed too. So I think you're going to be a good example for that. And I think you're right. There's a lot of fear, and especially for type A, if you are type A personality, maybe even more of like you want it to go a certain way. And you really just, especially right now, the job market is very, very competitive. We're no longer there was like a beautiful post pandemic boom of lots of job opportunities, but it is more competitive now. So you may not be able to end up specifically where you want to, but I've also been a big believer that internships are a great way to figure out what you like and don't like, and that you may not, the real world experience piece teaches you a lot more than what you will learn in school about what you like or not.
Yep, exactly.
So you did a production apprenticeship, and then you went over to Paramount, and you were a media intern there before eventually then making that childhood dream of yours come true and moved to New York to do production. So can you tell me a little bit about that transition?
Yeah, so like I said, with it when I was in college, I interned my summer going into my senior year in New York at an advertising agency. I didn't necessarily put a department down that I thought I would be a good fit for, because I thought I could be a good fit for a lot of them. Like I said, they placed me in production. I really enjoyed it. I loved being in New York. That part was confirmed, check. So my dreams there were going to come true. And I knew I wanted to, again, stay in advertising. So I ended up getting an internship following post-grad, and that turned into me becoming an associate producer at Droga5, which is another agency in New York. And on that team, I was focused, it was an interactive production role. So within that, it was more focused on anything for web development, eventing, out of home. I also dabbled in post-production, animation. I kind of ran the gamut of anything you could do in that space, which was just such an incredible learning opportunity, especially now where I am today on the client side. And one of the things I really enjoyed about it was, being a producer, you kind of are in charge, just like that's the inherent role. And that's what the job description is. You're running projects and you're the point person for organizing everything. You're kind of a project manager in a way. So, at 22, being the need to run a team and have people kind of respect you and acknowledge you and have an authority on a team where people probably don't trust you, that was a hard learning curve, but I think it was such a good thing to have happen to me at 22, especially in a city where I didn't necessarily know anyone. I was really thrown into this role. And it really taught me how to communicate well with other people, how to, create myself in a situation that generated people, respecting me without coming across as one, maybe too aggressive or meek. You can run, especially with women, I think you can kind of get afraid that you're going to hit one end or the other. But through that time, it was just such a great experience. Like I said, I had a lot of projects I was able to participate in. I had also a wide range of clients. I was working on Johnsonville sausages and New York Times. So really I was all across the board on my time there. But really what happened was CoverGirl ended up being one of my clients, and I really did a big social campaign for them. And at that point, I started realizing I wanted to focus on clients that I actually was super, super passionate about. And I started to decide, maybe this agency model isn't necessarily where I want to continue to grow my career. I also was, again, learning a lot in production, but I started to realize, me being the planner, looking at my 3-5 year career trajectory, production is such a niche sector. And the skills that you learn in terms of like hard skills, it's kind of hard to transfer out of it because it is so technical. You have such an expertise in that vertical, but you kind of end up getting stuck there. And I didn't necessarily, again, love it as much as I thought I was going to once I started activating in the space past an internship. So I started kind of, synthesizing all this information. I knew I wanted to go client side. I didn't necessarily know how I wanted to do it or what I wanted to do over there, but I knew I wanted to get to that point. And I knew at that time I didn't necessarily have all the skills necessary, which kind of led me to think about pursuing my MBA. Again, I had a liberal arts college background. I didn't really have quantitative skills in my back pocket. So, kind of with all of that together, is really how I made the decision to go pursue an MBA.
Is an interesting, I guess, analysis of like looking at where you were in your career. And I think it's interesting to, or I think it's important to understand what the growth trajectory looks like in your role. And if you like the growth trajectory, because you're right, you may like the beginning and the internship and the entry level role, but is it really a place where you see yourself long term? And if it's not, how are you going to get out of that situation? Before we go on to your MBA, I want to talk a little bit more about this production role, because you're right, it is such a niche space. And I have never really, met a young woman that's like, I want to be a production assistant when I get older. And I'm sure they're out there, I'm sure they are, but it's not as common. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what this role looks like? You mentioned that it's very technical. You mentioned that, maybe you need some good leadership skills to be in that role, but what exactly does it entail?
Yeah. So when you're on an agency side, I mean, you could be a producer across a variety of different sectors. You could be a film producer. You could be, what I did, which was interactive. You could be an event producer. You really can do a lot of things with it. But specifically within my role at an advertising agency, how we came into projects was, you get the brief, the creatives, they would come up with the ideas, then producers would come into the room and start to evaluate the feasibility of what these projects were in the creative vision, knowing time, knowing budget, knowing how we wanted to execute it. So first and foremost, you kind of were the no person and also a solution oriented person, because a lot of these dreams just weren't realistic. So that was a hurdle at the beginning, telling creatives who, it's a very, very, a lot of these ideas are very dear to their heart, telling them that it might not necessarily be possible. And you also have to be, thoughtful in a way of like, if we can't do this, what's option B, rather than just being not solution oriented, which is a little hard to do at the beginning of your career because you don't know what those creative solutions are. So it also was a lot of absorbing of information. It's a job that really requires a lot of mentorship because it is so technical. So, if you're developing a microsite, I had no idea how to do that. So you have to have someone really take you along the way through it. But once you get the project brief and you have the alignment of what you're going to create, then you run the implementation of it. So you really see it from start to end as it comes to life, which was really great. The only part that I wasn't necessarily in love with was I wasn't brought in, and you aren't really necessarily brought in when the creative is ideating, which is really what I wanted to get involved in as well. I loved being a part of the end piece and seeing it come to life, but I was a dreamer. I wanted to be part of all of it. And I really enjoyed, seeing the thought process of, how they came to these ideas. So that, and once again, kind of led me to shift afterwards. But in terms of the leadership, you are the point person for the account management team, for the creative team. You are accountable for getting things done on time. You have to, if something's going over budget, how can you fix it? What cuts can you make that still make sense? A lot of these, you have to be quick on your feet, and you also have to come into meetings and be confident in what you're presenting, and once again generate some sort of authority in the room, which again, when you're 22, also advertising is pretty well known that it's a male dominated industry, especially when you look on the creative side of things. So being 22, being a woman in a room that was predominantly filled with men who also are creatives, which can be a little bit more sensitive, it was a great learning experience, and it did kind of teach me to have a little bit of a thicker skin, and it also taught me how to not take things personally and come out of a meeting and assess what I could have done better and how I can work with myself to get my point across. So overall, it was a great, and to this day, everything I know about production helps me in my current role, because when I work with agencies, I now know what it takes. When I can read estimates, I can, understand the costing. I know where I can push back on those things. So at the end of the day, it definitely benefited me where I am today. And I think it really shaped me as I've grown in my career.
It definitely sounds like a very challenging role. So I could see how it would shape you and grow, because you moved to New York, which I'm already assuming is a very different environment than California.
Yes, it is.
You're super young, and you are in this position, like you said, you're telling people no, you are having to take the leadership, and you are, surrounded by predominantly men. So I can imagine just how hard that was and how much imposter syndrome you had to deal with during that time. But I love your perspective on it now. And I think it's a beautiful thing when you don't have a perfectly linear career journey, is that these different experiences give you a unique perspective and edge up within your role.
Mm-hmm.
My last thing I want to talk about before we go into your MBA is that you officially made your childhood dream come true by not just like doing an internship in New York, but actually moving there, getting a job, living there. What did it like? Was it exactly what you dreamed of? Because I think a lot of people dream of moving to New York. Or like, what were some of the realities that you were hit with when you moved to this new city, or even now that you've lived there for so long?
I think a lot of people feel this post grad, so I don't want to necessarily say it's New York specific, but one of the biggest transitions I had was, in college, you have this built in like social life because you go to college, or excuse me, you go to class with your friends, you live with a lot of your friends, you do a lot of, like, you're just like, if you're in Greek life, you have, your sorority or your fraternity, like you have consistent socialization around you. And once you graduate college, that starts to fall off. You have to go out of your way to get that. It's like you're not necessarily living with your friends. I moved here without knowing anyone. A lot of my friends ended up moving within 6 months or a year, but at the beginning, I didn't know anyone. I found my roommates randomly online. I had some people that I knew tangentially in the city, but I had to really go out of my way to get them, organize drinks, organize dinners, and it really put myself out there in a way that I didn't necessarily have to do undergrad. And that was definitely kind of a learning curve for me, and being comfortable and maybe not having something built into my social life every single minute. I'm also an extrovert, so it was extra a little hard for me to process. But once again, I think a lot of people feel that regardless of where they're living. In New York, it's also just so much going on at all times. So you do kind of have this pressure to have something going on at all times. So I think at first, I kind of had this expectation that I would, have the same type of social life that I did in undergrad. And I built that for myself as I got here, but it wasn't something that was a given. It was definitely something that I had to work at, put myself out there consistently, and also be comfortable just kind of being by my own sometimes.
How long do you think it took you until you were able to build a solid social life? Like, did it happen for you in a year? Did it happen over several years? Is it something that you're still working on, moving to a new city?
I think, I always like to continue to bring new people in my life. So I like to say I'm continuously working on it. I did get lucky, I will say, that some of my really close friends from college ended up, like I said, moving out within about 6 months. So I did have their support once they got here. I also got incredibly lucky. One of the girls I ended up moving up with, we just clicked and hit it off right away. So a lot of those things did work in my favor. But, I would say it took me that first summer of just really putting myself out there a lot, hanging out with people that I didn't necessarily think liked me back. It's kind of like dating, so like waiting for them to follow up and ask you to hang out with again, wondering if I'm being too pushy or not. But I think it took me
Yeah.
like a year to really feel okay with how I am. And also, I also worked on trying to build different friendships outside of maybe just like one core group that I kind of had established in college. Again, it's always just being open to finding new people. I take French classes. I've started those up again. So finding friends through that avenue and working on kind of identifying different groups of people that I could bring into my life. But like I said, it's something that I focus on consistently. So I always like finding new people and bringing them into my social circle. But yeah, I would say it took me about like a year to feel really comfortable here. But I think there's a beauty in being uncomfortable, because it means that you're pushing yourself. And I had a little bit of a confidence in that if I ever started to self-doubt, knowing that that uncomfortability means I'm growing. So
That's beautiful. And I love talking about this because so many people are now moving. I think the pandemic also really spurred that in people, where they, got up and moved. I did that. I moved to Austin. I didn't know anybody when I moved here. And making friends when you're out of college is just so hard, and everyone struggles with it in different areas of your life. Maybe you move to a newer city, even later, and you have to do the same thing all over again. But what you said about you have to be the one actively making those, it is like dating. And it's also hard because when it's girls, because when typically or generally or oftentimes when girls date guys, you know, they wait for the guy to ask them out and they wait for the guy to plan the date and they wait for the guy to do this. But when it's girls, like I did the same thing when I moved to Austin of like reaching out. It's like, okay, like I have to be the one to like ask and I have to be the one to organize and plan it and do all the things and really put yourself out there, because especially for me, when I moved here, I lived alone and I had my own business. So it's like I had coworkers. So the only way you really get to meet people is by really, really putting yourself out there in uncomfortable ways. But you're also really right of like, yeah, I maybe don't talk to a lot of the people that I initially like met with or did dinners and drinks with when I first moved here, but it was a really cool skill that I got to build and gave me a lot of confidence, like going into new situations of like, okay, now I know I can do this again and I can meet people and talk to anybody.
Yeah, and I think it still kind of translates, like even professionally, like you
Yeah.
are networking, you are dating, and it's the same type of thing when you're looking at it for a professional experience. Like entering a room for any type of event within your industry is so overwhelming. So I think all of those, you know, skills do transfer across your whole kind of all of your facets of life, and it's just getting this larger confidence in who you are, and it's a better understanding of who you are. So it was something that definitely pushed me out of my comfort zone. But again, I have these new people in my life that, you know, I value so dearly, and they've added so much to my life, and they necessarily aren't people that I would have thought I would have met just coming to New York, you know. So it's just putting yourself out there. It's a skill to definitely develop. But you know, I definitely grew a lot by coming out here on my own. So
Yeah, I love that. All right. Now we're gonna go and talk about the MBA. So you went to NYU, and if you can tell me a little bit about what your goal was, like what, you know, why you chose what you studied and taking your master's program and what your experience during that was like.
yeah, so like I said, I kind of was hitting this point when I was in production, just kind of knowing that where I was at, I wasn't going to get to where I envisioned myself in my next step. And I really saw my solution being an MBA. My dad had always wanted me to get an MBA at some point, and I didn't necessarily think it was a right fit for me because I always saw MBAs transitioning into a consulting career or investment banking, and I knew I definitely did not want to do that. I knew I wanted to stay within the marketing space, but I found this program at NYU, and it's one of their newer programs. It's a focused MBA, and it's in the fashion and luxury industry. It's also an accelerated MBA, so it's 1 year instead of 2 years. It felt like a perfect fit for me because I knew I wanted to go into that sector, whether it be fashion, beauty, luxury, whatever it may be. That's really what I had an affinity for. So it just felt like this massive perfect fit. So within 4 months, or I think it was honestly 3 months, I studied, took the GMAT, applied, did my interview, got the acceptance, and I started this in December. And then May, I was starting my MBA. So it
Oh
was
my gosh.
a quick turnaround. It was a lot of late nights, but it definitely paid off in the end. And I'm so incredibly thankful that I made that career switch that quickly. But yeah, within my time there, it was just such a great program for what I wanted to do. Within the program, you take all the same beginner classes as a standard MBA. I refer to them as 101s that you would do in college, like your GEs. But then as you move into your electives, they're hyper focused on the fashion industry, the luxury industry, retail spaces, beauty. So that way you are getting a more focused education. Also, we had corporate visits that were focused on those sectors. We also had international immersion opportunities. So in January, we were able to go to Paris and Milan. We went to a variety of different corporations like Dolce & Gabbana, Estee Lauder, L'Oreal. So really, it is an experience to get you in the door within that sector, which again, I knew I wanted to go in. I didn't know what I wanted to do or which of those I wanted to go into. So when it started coming the time to looking for opportunities, I really was going across anything I could find. I was trying to get coffee chats with anyone I could get on the phone, whether it was someone I was looking at, you know, even in the fitness industry. I was thinking of like, you know, luxury athleisure, you know, luxury gyms. I was looking at luxury spirits. I was thinking about going into fashion. I was looking at, so I was really all across the board, not knowing not only where in terms of industry I wanted to go, but also the type of role. I knew marketing was something I was always interested in. I like to think I had a creative side to me. but I didn't really know what that meant in terms of a job title. So through talking to a lot of people, I also did an exercise, which I also encourage a lot of people to do. I have a lot of friends that are thinking about career changes, but I did this exercise where I kind of, again, looked in all of these sectors and I just printed out job descriptions of things that interested in me and also things that I knew I was not qualified for. So I printed out like executive director roles. I printed out roles that were graphic designers. I am not a creative by trade, but I printed out anything I could find and I started highlighting things that interested in me. And again, they didn't have to be things I felt I was qualified for, but it was just this idea of to see on paper, okay, what does this look like? Like, what is my actual dream and how can I create it into a role and start to search a little bit narrowed down and figure out what makes sense for me. So really through all of that, I kind of, again, realized global marketing was really where I wanted to go. It fit my skill set, it fit my interests, and it was really me finally getting an understanding of what that title was. In terms of beauty, I still at that point, didn't necessarily care how I got into global marketing because I do love all of the things that I was looking at. It just happened by, once again, circumstance. Typically, the beauty industry does have a higher value of the MBA. They're more known for rotational programs. I was the youngest in my class at NYU, and I was facing a lot of struggles getting my foot in the door because if you're just looking at my cohort, I didn't have by any means as near much experience as a lot of the people that I was competing with. And once again, I kind of made the assessment that a rotational program would best suit me and get me that accelerated experience quickly because I didn't come from any relative background related to anything that I was applying for. So really Shiseido fell into my lap through that. That was the offer that I got. And it was the beauty industry for me. So that's kind of my sum of my MBA experience, but really it was so valuable for me because it helped me make that pivot. And I think, to your point, we're in a space where, the job industry, the job market's changing. And it allowed me to make that pivot in a way that I don't think I would have been able to if I was just applying to jobs. This is also very specific to me, and MBA might not be the fit for everyone. But for my story and the trajectory that I was going on, it was the most valuable decision I could have made.
It seems like it allowed you to make that switch into where you wanted to be, but also it's interesting that you took so much time to figure out where you actually wanted to go. And I feel like most people skip over that step of like, okay, where do I actually want to be? Not just like who's gonna give me a job offer, but where do I want to work? And I love that little exercise that you explained as well. And I think it's so important to place more intention on those roles because I think especially like, and when the job market's not great, there is a lot of pressure just to accept whatever company is going to pay you or to just apply and see what sticks. But you were very intentional about figuring out where you wanted to be and what you wanted your career growth to look like. I'm also curious, when you did this MBA program, you said it was an accelerated program. So I'm assuming it was a lot more workload than a normal MBA. So did you take a year off working as well?
I was the anomaly. I ended up working 30 hours a week of a retail
Oh my
job.
gosh.
So I made it work. I wanted an income to support me. I knew I couldn't do a full-time job. But once again, it was great doing that. It was a lot of work. I'm not going to lie. A lot of late nights. I missed a lot of weekends with my friends. I had to make a lot of sacrifices for that. It was hard. I'm not going to say that I would necessarily recommend it if you don't need to, but it also is possible if you do need to. You'll make it through. But even that experience was so great because I was able to get experience, and I didn't really think of it like this way at the time. And I actually had my professor kind of enlighten me on this. We were talking one day, and I was working at a jewelry store, so I was going to go to work after I was decked out in jewelry across because you had to when you worked. And she made a comment. She was like, "I love your jewelry." And I explained to her, I was like, "Yeah, I have to go to this job afterwards." And she just was astounded. She was like, "That is such great experience. Why is this not on your resume?" And I told her, I was like, "I don't know why it would be." Because to me, it's just a side retail job. It's nothing exemplary that you're seeing in an MBA. And she helped me realize that this is exemplary. You are working in a retail space. If you're trying to get into fashion or beauty, you can now say that you have retail experience, you know the consumer, you've been in that space, you know what it takes to run a store. You can say you have retail operations experience. On top of it, it shows that you can manage all of this while going to school. So once again, why is this not on your resume? And I think that was a great thing for me to hear. And especially when you're thinking of all those internships when you're doing undergrad, not necessarily knowing if they're important or of value. Any experience is. You can think of something of how it can position yourself into a higher role. Every experience is worthwhile. So that was just, at the beginning, I didn't really think anything of it. And I'm so glad someone kind of made me feel proud about that, and also made me realize this is something that's benefiting me outside of just, financially. So you can do it if you want to work as well. It's a lot of work. So
I'm so happy you shared that example from your professor, because there are so many women that I will work with that don't want to put their retail experience, or don't want to put that, bartending or restaurant or whatever they had to do during school to keep themselves afloat. And, I'm like, why is there this gap in your resume? And they're like, well, I did work, but I don't want to put it on. But you are absolutely right, especially if you had to do a job while you were in school. You are getting to showcase different experience. I remember I had a student in our accelerator that she was she was a bartender. She was like, I was in my interview and they just kept talking about my bartending experience, and they loved just hearing about how, the skills of a bartender, you have to be social and talk. And they were just like, kept talking about it. And it was the thing that they like were able to connect on, and that allowed her to enter into the marketing industry and get this cool role. So super interesting. And like what you said too, you were doing that on top of doing your MBA program and being the youngest person in your MBA program, which is just amazing.
Yeah, it was definitely, it was an experience, and it was, like I said, it's a lot of work and dedication, but I would do it all over again in 5 seconds, inclusive of the 30-hour weeks, because it just taught me how to, again, be comfortable in the sacrifices that, you're making. I did have to give up a lot in terms of, I thought my life wouldn't change as much as it did, but it did. It also, I graduated in May 2020. So that was also a little bit of a pivot there as well. But for me in my career and where I was personally, it was just the best experience and the best decision I think I made.
So now transitioning from getting your MBA and doing all that research, and you did this rotational program at Shiseido. Can you talk to me a little bit about your journey there, which is where you currently are now?
Yeah, so like I said, I entered through a rotational program. It consisted of 2 rotations over the course of a year. My first rotation was with NARS on their global digital strategy team. And once again, it wasn't this global marketing role that I knew I would wanted, but I kind of positioned myself with going into the role rather than, being frustrated that it might not be the placement that I necessarily wanted in the long run. How can I learn from this experience, and how can I leverage once again myself coming out of it, because it's only 6 months, I can get this done, and how can I also do well in the role? So on that team, I actually, my main project was figuring out how NARS could enter the gaming industry. So I learned a lot about that.
Interesting.
Did a lot of research. Once again, did not think that's where I was going to go after I graduated. But, I did a lot of research, especially on our Asia markets. I worked a lot with our media teams. I worked a lot on how to innovate within media. I also did a lot of social planning. So within that, I learned so much about things that I didn't even know I was going to research or even touch upon in my beauty career. And then after that, I was placed on Tory Burch Beauty, specifically working on fragrances. Within that transition as well, I knew I wanted 2 experiences within the portfolio. First, I was on NARS, which is an incredibly large brand. It's makeup as well as skincare. Their team is just huge. They're such a well-run team as well as a brand. They have such a strong brand identity. Now moving over to Tory Burch on their global marketing team, it was a brand that we had recently acquired from, once they left Estee Lauder, it moved over to Shiseido. And within that, it was kind of this, we were working on a rebranding and a relaunch into the market, and how can she re-enter in a way that she hadn't prior. it's a small team. It was a lean team. We didn't have anything at the market that was new under Shiseido. So really having those two experiences was crazy, in such a good way, because it also allowed me to figure out what type of work environment I wanted to work in and where I also would succeed in. And it's not to say one's working better than the other. Some people really enjoy being on a larger team where everything's ironed out, where there's a lot of processes. Other people really love startups, and there's no wrong or right answer there. And I actually always thought I was better suited for a larger team. I love where I am now, and I love working on a small team. It's very much so a startup mentality, and I clicked really quickly on the team. But like I said, I was initially on the global marketing team. I was working on some projects on the beginning, that I was interested in, but at the time we were gearing up for a really large campaign shoot for our first fragrance launch. It was a collection we launched last August. But this was back in 2021, and I was so interested in what was going on over there. I would hear what was happening after the meetings, but I just wanted to be so much involved in that. And it was really the communications team that was running that, with global marketing coming in just to, check in on everything. But the day-to-day was with communications. So I didn't necessarily care. I just knew I wanted to be involved in that. And I flagged it, and I alerted my supervisor, just saying, if there is any support needed over there, I can help. I'm more than willing to. I have an interest in it. So I got kind of moved over there. I ended up supporting the VP of communications, within that development. And since then, I have not left. She's still my boss to this day. And again, within that transition, I now am on the communications team. And I thought this whole time I wanted to be on global marketing. And once again, it's this whole experience of being open to these transitions. I thought I was just going to help with that and then move back over to what global marketing is. And I haven't left communications, and I found this really strong affinity for it. And currently in my role now, I help with all creative development. I'm not a creative. I have creatives I support the creatives, but it's being a part of all that development, content strategy, go-to-market tactics, any launch eventing, influencer relations, things like that. And once again, coming from an MBA, did not ever think that that was going to be where I ended up. I fully thought global marketing was where I was going to go. And I also still love global marketing. We're a very, very tight team, and we have a lot of overlap in that regard, but I'm now on the communications team, and it's just something that really fell into my lap, by advocating for something that I was interested in. And now I'm in this role. But through Shiseido, I was really, really lucky, like I said, to have those two experiences, because it did let me learn of what I'm good at, what I liked, what I didn't like, and the things that I didn't necessarily have an affinity for. It allowed me to learn and then take that experience and leverage myself even further of where, I am today on Tori. So, yeah, long-winded story short, that is kind of how I ended up where I am at Shiseido.
Emily, you're just the poster child for changing and pivoting and transitioning.
Yep.
And I love it, because at the core of it is you just following your heart or following your passion and what excites you and what you love, and not putting yourself in, just because I got my MBA, I have to do this, or, because I went to school for this, I have to do this, or because I have this experience, I have to do this. Like, you really paved your own path for yourself. And I think that's very special. And I think it also takes a lot of bravery to be able to do that and say, I know I spent the last year putting myself through hell to get to this role, but maybe what I thought was actually fit for me is something a little bit different. And I also really loved, you mentioned briefly how the way you were able to transition into communications was by just telling your manager, like, hey, I'm interested in this and I would like to help out. And I think that's a really good place to start, is if you are in a role and you're noticing like, oh, wow, what that team is doing seems super cool or super exciting, is don't just internalizing not those thoughts, but actually tell your boss about it. And it's that, then you got put on and you got to help that team. And then that turned into something that you ended up doing long-term.
Yeah, I think, I think it's really, really important to be your biggest advocate, because at the end of the day, no one else will be. There are people that are absolutely going to support you in the long run, but if you don't vocalize really what you want and how you want it, people can't read your mind. They think they can get you where you want to go. but I also believe you're not going to know the answers to the questions that you don't ask. So ask those questions. Don't feel like you're being pushy. Follow up with the people and advocate for yourself. And that's kind of really how I got to the place that I am within Tory Burch. I just picked up on things that I was interested in. And I also am very incredibly lucky that I do have a team that's very supportive of interests. I was very welcome to try new opportunity. And also they listened to things that I wasn't necessarily super interested in, but obviously willing to do. But you know, like I said, be your advocate, put the meetings on the calendar, even if it's reviews. I love, you know, this sounds kind of backwards, but I love negative feedback because that means I can grow from it. I don't necessarily like, I like positive feedback, don't get me wrong, but I prefer hearing those negative things or things that because that to me translates to things that I can work on. I can't necessarily use positive feedback to continue to grow. But yeah, through all of it, it just kind of taught me even further to just vocalize my interests, vocalize anything I may need. Because at the end of the day, there's the worst case is the answer no, and I can live with that. And I know that I asked the question. So
yeah, it's, I think, a really good takeaway for everyone. If there's something that you want to do, vocalize it. And like you said, you know, the only answer to questions you don't ask is going to be no. So might as well put yourself out there. And so we've gone through so much in this episode through your career, and it's been very inspiring hearing about all of the moves that you made to really, you know, really in pursuit of doing work that you love. Now, looking back on everything, what is some advice that you would give to yourself when you were just starting out that maybe you wish you knew sooner?
oh my, I think it's just letting go. And I learned how to do this, but again, it took me a little while. Letting go of feeling like you need to have everything planned out for yourself. You know, like I said, I always have been a planner. I still am to this day, but I try to let go of control on some things. Just being comfortable and not knowing the future. I also have tried to learn how to be a little bit more present because my mindset is always future oriented. It's always, where am I going to go next? How am I going to get there? I mean, clearly I'm always moving around. So it's just focus more and try to be more present on things and not just consistently looking forward. I think, you know, on top of it, it's just really being okay with where you're at. I think I had a lot of imposter syndrome at the beginning. I also compared myself a lot to a lot of other people, even people that weren't necessarily in my industry. And that kind of made me self-doubt a lot. Internally at my first job, I was seeing promotions happen that I felt like I was qualified for, but I wasn't necessarily happening to me. You know, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. It's just be confident in who you are and be confident of where you're going because you clearly have the skills necessary. So I think it's just really get that confidence early on, but in all reality, that's really hard to do, especially when you're younger and starting out. But focus on yourself, stay in your lane, and try not to compare yourself to anyone else because at the end of the day, it's your journey and you know where you're going. You're confident in yourself. And I think the last thing is I think there's always this notion of be confident in what you know. I think now looking back, there is such a value of being confident in what you don't know. Especially when you start out, there's this, I think, embarrassment of asking stupid questions, as we label them. Sometimes when you're trying to get an answer, you don't want to CC your boss because you don't want to see like them see you make a mistake. Sometimes you BS your way through meetings and you claim to know something that you should know, but you don't. Now, where I'm at today, when I'm working with people that are underneath me, I tell them, please ask me questions. Do not assume anything. Come to me. I will answer every question that you have. Because also, when you're understanding of what you don't know, once again, it's how you grow and it's how you learn those things. And it actually sets you up for better success because it evades any opportunity for you to make a mistake that you probably would have made trying to protect yourself and not ask those questions.
I don't even know. You left me speechless with all of that amazing last advice. I hope that if you're listening, you're taking notes because I think everything you said is so powerful. And I think especially for women listening to the podcast, a lot of the topics that you mentioned mean, they're hard for everyone, but the comparison one especially, I just think is an eternal struggle of just seeing other people get promoted or seeing other people get flashy new jobs on LinkedIn or whatever it is, and just being able to focus on yourself and be confident in yourself and believe in yourself. And like you said, be open to change and to opportunity. And you just never know where your life or your career will take you. But Emily, this has been absolutely a joy to talk to you today and hear about your career journey and all of your wonderful advice for women in marketing. You are a powerhouse and have done so much in such a short amount of time. This is absolutely very inspiring, and I hope the people listening are just as inspired as I am by you. So thank you so much again for coming on the Sky Society podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy being here.